Another motive, perhaps the most peremptory, must be sought for in Bonaparte's character: impetuosity and love of revenge, which might be called vendetta corsica. That feeling was, besides, at the period I am describing, raised to the highest degree by his enemies. I heard him say a few days afterwards, "Let them throw all Europe on my shoulders. My part will then be to defend myself. Their attack is a legal one. But to blow up whole streets, to kill or maim more than 100 persons in the hope of coming at me, to send, as they now have done, 40 bravos to murder me, that is too much. I will make them shed tears of blood. They shall learn at their expense what it is to make murder legal." Revenge is but a vulgar passion, and still it is the commonest amongst kings. The first consul was worthy of setting himself above it. I should have wished him to have had the Duc d'Enghien arrested and condemned, but after the judgment to have sent for him, have given him the proofs that were obtained by his having conspired against him, and then to have immediately sent him over to England. I am sure the prince's heart was too noble not to be moved by such an act of magnanimity. And if his family were destined one day to reign again, Bonaparte would not have found in him an enemy, nor in his own heart a reproach, which he was never able to silence. For the rest, their actions served as a foundation to the fabric of horror raised against him all over France and Europe. But without naming all the princes who, after having committed the same fault, have nevertheless retained the respect of mankind, does not the greatest and wisest of our writers, Montesquieu, when speaking of Alexander, say, he burned Persepolis and killed Cletus? But etc. I went to St. Cloud a few days after the trial. I was accustomed, while waiting for the order to enter the closet of the first consul, to stop in the library with a young man named Ripaul, who took care of his books, and who told me that the day before, while going out of that room, Bonaparte perceived a bust of the great Condé placed in a passage leading to his closet. He immediately said to Ripaul, with an abrupt tone and an agitated voice, "Let that bust be placed somewhere else." The arrival of the prince and his death were known at the same moment at the palace. Madame Bonaparte burst into tears and threw herself at her husband's feet to obtain the prince's pardon. It was too late. His sister-in-law, Madame Elisa, wrote him a letter composed by Fontaine. He remonstrated with her for having sent it, but without any appearance of resentment. Caulaincourt, on his arrival from Strasbourg, learned the fatal news from Madame Bonaparte. His grief was so great that he fainted. I have no doubt of his having been a perfect stranger to the arrest of the Duc d'Enghien, and my proof is his having accepted the place of chief equerry. Caulaincourt would never have deigned to receive the wages of blood. His elevation was only owing to his merit and attachment to the first consul. This fatal coup d'etat had not yet ceased harassing Bonaparte's mind when it received another violent shock by the death of Pichegru. He had been arrested, examined, and confronted. The worthless behavior of the subalterns towards him and the total ruin of his hopes made him resolve to avert the horrors he had still to encounter by ridding himself of a life he had no more means of prolonging. Perhaps also he was urged to the act by the shame of having associated with such accomplices for the performance of such a crime. He was found dead in prison. It would be insulting both Bonaparte and Pichegru to imagine that one of the two could have taken the other's life in that manner. One must not seek to rob that energetic soul of the glory of having nobly escaped from the hands of his enemies. His retreat was that of a gallant warrior, and if all the particulars that have been published were not sufficient to exonerate Bonaparte from the suspicion of having murdered him, the character Pichegru, well known to those who approached him, had left not the least doubt in their minds. The condemnations of the other prisoners created a general feeling of pity, particularly among the family of the first consul and those who were devoted to his person. Too much blood has already been spilled, and every person ought to obtain from the sovereign the pardon of some victim or other. Madame Bonaparte took upon her to save Monsieur de Rivière and the Polignacs. I accompanied to Saint-Cloud Madame Louis Bonaparte, Hortense, having by her side the daughter of La Jolie, the mother of the first consul, and Madame Joseph, the wife of General Murat, Caroline, and her two sisters undertook to solicit the pardon of the others. When I arrived at Saint-Cloud, the first consul, on perceiving me, said, "What are they doing in my wife's apartments? They are weeping, and she the most of all. It is a heartbreaking sight." I had found him agitated. His emotion grew more and more visible. He walked 2 or 3 times up and down the closet and said, "The wretches wanted to murder me. What a base act!" He then went out of the room. A little while afterwards, the sister of Monsieur de Rivière and the female relations of the Polignacs came in, led by Madame Bonaparte, and fell at his feet. He did not hesitate a moment, but immediately signed the pardon of Messieurs de Polignac and de Rivière. Georges had written to Murat a very noble letter in which he solicited not his own pardon, but those of his companions. The general read it to me with emotion. He offered, however, to be the first to throw himself on the English coast if life was granted to him. It was, he said, only changing the manner of his death, but in that way at least it would be useful to his country. His letter was read in a secret council. Bonaparte himself appeared disposed to pardon, but it was represented to him that those men had killed public functionaries in the streets, that no favor could be allowed to a double murder, that it would be showing a sort of favor to murderers, and discourage those whose duty it was to defend him. That Georges, an obscure man in his own party, was after all nothing but a leader of banditti, famous only for atrocious acts, and in one word, that if he were spared, nobody could with justice be punished. He was executed with 9 of his accomplices, and the mob, according to their custom, went to see the tragedy performed, and to seek emotions at the sight of the violent death of individuals who had attempted to recall the Bourbons. This conspiracy made the first consul sensible that he ought to hasten his ascent to the throne. It was the secret wish of all those whose ambition looked for favors which a republic was unable to bestow. To Bonaparte it offered not alone protection, but also an extent of power, of which he felt the want for the execution of his great design. Besides that, it was the only means of reconciling to his government the sovereigns of Europe who trembled at the thought of a republic. England alone excepted, being scarcely a monarchy in its foreign concerns, all the other powers were convinced that the presence of a monarch in France would stem the torrent of republican ideas and the discontent that prevailed among all nations. Peace had already been concluded with all and confirmed during the consulate. The Emperor Paul had gone further still. In his hatred of the English, he found a powerful auxiliary in the first consul. Both these monarchs sought to mark their reign by illustrious actions, and their common hatred of the English had brought them a great deal nearer to one another. There had been some questions of an expedition to India by their joint forces. The Emperor Paul imprudently betrayed his secret and perished. His death was probably as much owing to that circumstance as to the despotism with which he swayed his family and his court. The return, so skillfully prepared from republic to monarchy, was marked by the most solemn ceremony the Christian world had witnessed for the last 1,000 years. All Christendom was most ardently wishing that the kingdom of France, after having presented to the world a deplorable example of scandalous impiety, might also offer a majestic instance of a nearer return to the Christian religion. The Pope, rising above all mean passions, hatred, and prejudice, convinced, besides, that the leader of France was directed by Providence, concluded a treaty dictated by wisdom, policy, and the sanctity of his high calling. He could not have resisted the wish that was expressed to him to consecrate the union of church and state by the authority of his presence, and the pompous ceremonies of that worship, which acknowledged in him its sovereign pontiff. He left Rome and came to France. The first consul received him at Fontainebleau, and the most majestic gravity presided over their mutual relations during the whole of his stay in France. The ceremony of the coronation was the most solemn that ever had bestowed a sacred character on the legitimacy of a sovereign. The Pope, a venerable old man surrounded by all his prelates, and by more than 100 French bishops, ordained with his consent the chief functionaries of the state, the whole diplomatic body of Europe, and the universal assent of France and the army, have given to that act a degree of legitimacy which the House of Bourbon will never be able to weaken. These united claims to all that is legitimate among men were perhaps not sufficiently felt by the emperor when he abdicated at Fontainebleau. His resistance would undoubtedly have cast him into captivity, but what ought his own fate to have been in his eyes? He was persecuted as a sovereign, but his son never could forfeit his right, and although he abdicated in his favor, that modified act was void, because not expressed by his own sacrifice. I shall have an opportunity of recalling these reflections to mind. England soon felt that the peace with the whole continent and with herself would be fatal to her. The expedition to St. Domingo had begun successfully. It was altogether a bad enterprise that ought not to have entered into the plans of the emperor. But the remembrance of the prosperity of St. Domingo, the numerous colonists who had fled to France and sighed over the wreck of their fortune, called loudly for the conquest of that island. The emperor yielded to the general delusion and to a desire of employing his navy, which was eager to share the national glory. The Directory had made a bad choice and taken half measures. This was more than sufficient to produce failure. The general to whom they had given the command of the expedition was a man of little capacity, though of great personal integrity. He failed and fell a victim to the skill of the blacks. He was shipped off and sent away with the reputation of a dupe and the disgrace he had cast on the name of the French. The general to whom the emperor entrusted the second expedition had more sense and talent than his predecessor, but like him, he had to contend with a destructive climate and a power augmented by first success. It must also be acknowledged that liberty, with all its advantages, its energy, and its hopes, had given to the Negroes, already organized and proud of their former victory, a degree of strength and skill over which it was no longer possible to triumph. The general-in-chief died a victim to the climate, and although he had sent to France Toussaint Louverture, the chief man in the country, he sunk under the national energy and advantageous positions of his enemies. England seized the moment when the success of the expedition was doubtful to break the peace. Mr. Pitt, accustomed to trample on the most sacred rights and conventions, began the war without declaration, captured trading vessels, ruined merchants, and set the continent again on fire. Russia and Austria united and took up arms again. The emperor left the shores of the Atlantic for Austria and made the Admiral campaign, which terminated with the Battle of Austerlitz. It was then that I adopted for the first time on a large scale the system of expresses the emperor had commanded me to organize, and the invention of which was his. He had felt the inconvenience of letting a single man cross such a vast extent of country. More than once, the couriers, oppressed with fatigue or badly mounted, did not, by their speed, satisfy his impatience. He did not like either to put in the hands of a single man papers, the speedy reception of which might have a serious and sometimes decisive influence over the most important events. Consequently, by his orders, I organized the express service, which consisted in sending by the postilions of each stage the cabinet dispatches shut up in a portfolio of which he and I each had a key. When a postilion arrived at a stage, he delivered to the next one a little book on which the name of all the stages was inscribed, in which the hour of the arrival and departure of the dispatches was to be mentioned. Fines and severe punishment were inflicted for the loss of the little book, or for any negligence of the postmaster in setting down the hour of the arrival and departure of the dispatches. I had a great deal of trouble in obtaining a due execution of those forms, but by means of an active and constant superintendence, I succeeded at last, and the service continued during 11 years with most wonderful success. I was enabled to account exactly for a day's delay on a space of 400 leagues. The express departed and arrived every day from and to Paris, Naples, Milan, the mouths of the Cartereau, Madrid, Lisbon, and at a later period also Tilsit, Vienna, Petersburg, and Amsterdam. This plan, besides, ensured considerable economy. The couriers used to cost 7 francs and a half per post, whereas the expresses were no more than 3 francs. The emperor received on the 8th day the answers to the letters he addressed to Milan, and on the 15th to those of Naples. This service was very useful to him, and I may say without vanity that it proved one of the elements of his success. The campaign began by the affair of Ulm, which came like a thunderbolt. Russia was dismayed and hastened to hide her hostile projects. Austerlitz forced Austria to bend the knee, and the astonished Russians to fall back. The following year, Prussia was defeated in the Battle of Jena and added a fresh proof to 1,000 others that absolute monarchy is nothing if its leader be not the most skillful man in the nation. This event was also a proof that Prussia is not a strong nation. Its sovereign, dismayed by the loss of one battle, sought an auxiliary in the most distant north, while its army, which still contained pupils of Frederick the Great, had lost all its old energy and even the enthusiasm of its former glory. One day it fought, and the next it was nothing more than a mass of men without discipline or energy. One only saved the honor of the monarchy and preserved some sparks of the same fire that influences all hearts. This was not done by a prince of the House of Prussia, but by Blucher. And his march towards Lübeck, with his noble defense, gave the Prussians a great lesson of courage in adversity, the most important and most useful lesson men and nations can receive. These 2 years' triumph did not inspire the emperor with an idea of conquering Europe to become her master or her president. It was his genius and his character that developed the idea, for those great conquerors of the world are all cast in the same mold. Everywhere they must be first or perish. He had spent 4 years in his consulate discussing the civil code, an edifice which has already been shaken in one of its most important parts, but which will never be destroyed as long as the love of our country and a taste for civilization shall preside over our destinies. In the interval from his second war to his last, he busied himself with the interior administration. Some disorder, occasioned more by want of experience than by dishonesty, had arisen during his absence. On his return, he displaced some persons, rectified some of his choices, and gave to the general administration a lively, though steady impulse. His astonishing memory made him master of all things, not only in their ensemble, but also in their most minute details. The consequence of this was that his conversation was extremely perplexing for men who were not perfectly acquainted with the subjects they were to demonstrate. It was his constant application to all sorts of affairs and his excellent method of classing them in his mind that enabled him to carry his success so far. It has frequently happened to me to be less sure than he was of the distance of places and of a number of particulars in my department, which he knew well enough to correct. Monsieur de Talleyrand told me that as he was one day traveling with him from Bologna to Paris, a short time after the army had left the court for the banks of the Rhine, the emperor met a detachment of soldiers going to join their corps, which they did not know where to find. Having inquired the number of their regiment, he immediately calculated the day of their departure and the road they had taken and said to them, You will find your battalion at such a place. The army was at that time 200,000 men strong. The admirable order in which he arranged his ideas and his prodigious memory made him as much beloved by the soldiers as respected by the officers of the army. Everyone knew he never forgot the name of a brave man, and that it was always sufficient to recall to his memory some brave action to ensure its recompense. And whenever he promised anything, he always kept his word. I now proceed to the campaign of 1809. The success of the Wagram campaign had a considerable influence over the destinies of France. Not so much, however, because peace was once more ensured to the continent, as on account of the alliance between the two crowns. The first proposals of the marriage of the emperor with the Archduchess Maria Louisa were made at Vienna with Prince Metternich, notwithstanding the exertions of a considerable party that would not listen to such an alliance. I first suspected what was going forward through a singular circumstance. The emperor did not well know how to divorce a woman who was so deserving of his love and whose adorable qualities had made her an object almost of worship in the eyes of the French. He would not have been sorry to have seen others set an example which might make some impressions on the public and render the matter less difficult to him. At least, I have always thought so. Marshal Blank came to see me the day after his arrival. We were friends of long standing. He placed in me an unbounded confidence, and he spoke to me of his wife with great discontent. I had always thought him jealous, and I believe he did not do his wife justice. In our conversations, he even went so far as to say he could not live any longer with her. And he repeated to me what the emperor had said to him at Vienna. Napoleon affected to pity the marshal's domestic vexations and observed that the best thing he could do would be to end them by a divorce. You will never have any children by her, he added, and still you ought to wish that a name like the one you bear will not be lost. Divorce her, and then you may choose among the most illustrious families of France a consort who will give you successors to your rank and titles. The marshal, when he mentioned the fact to me and asked my advice, was as far as myself from suspecting the secret motive of the emperor's words. I had not the least doubt of his wife's virtue. She possessed many amiable qualities and brought him a considerable fortune. I advised him not to take a step he might perhaps long regret. He followed my advice, and I believe he acted wisely.